Have you ever been so gripped by a piece of media that you couldn't finish it? Or so intimidated by it that you couldn't even start it? I have. And truth be told, I don't really understand why. I think it's because some works, when it's too raw, become unbearable. For me, that work has always been Oyasumi Pun Pun. In my mind, it has always been the depression manga. What exactly that means, I can't fully explain, because I had never been able to finish it. I have only ever made it 10 or 15 chapters in before I had to set it down. I've known of it for years, whispers reaching me through online discussions and reputation. The words most often attached to it are bleak, melancholic, and tragic. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't usually drawn to stories like Pun Pun, stories steeped in despair, the kind that leave you raw and haunted. Yet when I open Pun Pun, something grips me, an unease so sharp that a voice whispers in my head with every page. You aren't ready. The premise of Pun Pun is simple, yet it's that simplicity of it that allows it to explore certain tragedies. It showcases just how terribly a good person's life can spiral out of control if they neglect to take hold of it. The story of Pun Pun is about the life of a young kid who is put into the form of a bird-like being, even though he is indeed human. It goes through his life, his dysfunctional family, and his struggle. In the beginning, many things are out of his control. When we are young, it is the decision of other people that affects us the most. But as he grows older and grows more and more complicit, he continues to do nothing, so he spirals into a depression. This story allows you to bear witness to all of it in an unfiltered form. But let's put a pin in Pun Pun for now. Let's take a step back and talk about tragedy itself, because I think that's where the heart of my issue lies. Tragedy, though deeply unsettling, is endlessly fascinating. We recoil from it, yet lean in closer. We weep at it, yet seek it out. It is as though humanity has some morbid magnetism towards suffering, as if grief itself becomes art when framed in story. One piece of media that captures this paradox brilliantly, a game that parades tragedy in front of us without ever feeling like that's what it's doing, is What Remains of Edith Finch. What Remains of Edith Finch is a tale of a cursed family, or at least that's the story Edie Finch, the matriarch of it, insists upon. Nearly every Finch dies young in strange and tragic ways. The game never confirms whether this curse is real, but it doesn't need to. What matters is the lens through which the family, and especially Edie, processes their pain. You, as the player, traverse the Finch home, a place less like a house and more like a museum. Every bedroom has been transformed into a shrine, a sealed exhibit curated by Edie to immortalize her lost children and grandchildren. Each room is a time capsule of a death. Each story is presented as a kind of art. And that's where the fascination and perversity of tragedy emerges most clearly. Edie doesn't just remember her family, she curates them, she transforms their tragedies into consumable stories, ready for others to experience. The Museum of the Finch home asks us not only to mourn, but to gawk. No story within it exemplifies this more than that of Barbara Finch. On the surface, Barbara's tale is framed as a cheesy horror comic, complete with campy narration and pulpy illustrations. But dig deeper and it becomes something far darker. But we'll get to that. Barbara was once a child star, beloved for her Scream and B-movie horror flicks. But as she grew older, her scream lost its power, and with it, her career faded. By 16, she was working as a waitress, clinging to the fading dream of Hollywood stardom. Then came the night of her 16th birthday, the last night anyone would see Barbara alive. Her story is told through the lens of a comic book left on her memorial. The comic recounts a strange, dreadful evening. Barbara practicing her famous scream with her boyfriend Rick, an emergency broadcast about mass killers, strange noises in the house, her younger brother Walter disappearing, and finally, the hoodlums. Monsters who descend upon her, demanding one last scream before tearing her apart, killing and eating her. Her story ends grotesquely, with only her ear left behind in a music box. Yet this story is immortalized not as a police report, not as a cautionary tale, but as a comic book left on her dresser. Another exhibit in Edie's Museum of Grief. It's dark, isn't it? But in the moment, most players don't think too much about it. By this point in the game, you've become almost numb to the Finch's deaths. Barbara's tale feels digestible, a comic book, a campy horror vignette, something easy to shrug off. But peel back the presentation and you can start to see a completely different story. This is my speculation that comes from a small obsession, so take this with a grain of salt. An example of my personal fascination with tragedy. There are details about Barbara the game hints at but never fully confirms. For one, the constant presence of a crutch, often assumed to belong to Rick, but appearing again and again in relation to Barbara herself. There's also the partially hidden poster in her room. Lame, the musical, a parody of Fame. I believe this is intentional. The premise of Fame is about how a group of students at New York's High School of Performing Arts chase their dreams of stardom. Across 4 years of study, they struggle with ambition, love, identity, and the harsh realities of what it takes to make it in music, dance, and acting. It's about the price of fame, the passion for art, and the challenges of growing up while pursuing big dreams. Sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? I believe that the word lame is deliberate here. I believe that it suggests that Barbara may have suffered a disability, perhaps from a skating accident, as the skates are a recurring motif for Barbara. If that's true, then Edie's comic book framing becomes even more grotesque. Barbara wasn't devoured by monsters, she wasn't a scream queen cut down by fate. She was a disabled teenager who was just dealt a horrible hand. Here's what I think really happened on that fateful night. Rick and Barbara argued that night. The shouting escalated, loud enough to terrify Walter, already on edge from late-night monster broadcasts on the radio. To him, the noise wasn't just fighting, it was monsters breaking into the house, attacking his sister. The argument spilled upstairs. Barbara was shoved against the railing, which gave way. She fell from the second floor. The fall killed her. Panicked, Rick tried to cover it up. He dumped her body in the river along with her crutches. Hours later, law enforcement arrived, finding the crutches but not the body until much later. But by that point, Rick was gone, vanishing into the night. That's what I think really happened. Stripped bare. No monsters, no break-in, just a tragic, senseless accident. And yet, that's not the story we remember, or even the story told to us. What endures isn't the truth but Edie's version. A tragedy rebranded as horror, grotesque loss reimagined as spectacle. Maybe that's why Pun Pun always eludes me. Where Edith Finch turns grief into a story you can consume, works like Pun Pun leave it jagged and uncurated. It doesn't let you stand at a distance, it forces you to drown with it. And maybe that's the truth about why we obsess over tragedy. We want it framed, softened, romanticized, something we can handle. But the raw thing, it's hard to get ready for that. Now, you may be thinking, but wait, I've consumed media that presents tragedy in a raw way. And you're right. There are many works that target the heart directly, that leave you clutching at your chest like a wounded dog. But here's the question. How many of those tragic stories you've experienced were actually presented that way? Raw, unfiltered. And how many were wrapped in spectacle, framed as epic or even romanticized to the point where the tragedy becomes palatable. Because more often than not, what feels raw in the moment has already been carefully staged for us. The sobering grief of death becomes the swelling strings of a soundtrack. The crumbling of a life becomes a Shakespearean soliloquy. The horror of war becomes an action set piece. We don't just consume tragedy, we consume the performance of it. Take The Truman Show. On the surface, it's not even a tragedy in the traditional sense. It's a satire, a comedy drama. Yet at its core, it's the story of a man whose entire life is stolen from him. Truman's suffering, his grief, his fear, his isolation is consumed by millions as a television program. His pain isn't just framed for an audience, it exists for an audience. His tragedy is curated as entertainment. But if The Truman Show externalizes this fascination, placing the spectacle of tragedy in the hands of fictional viewers, Neon Genesis Evangelion turns the lens back on us, the real audience, and forces us to ask, why do we watch this? Evangelion is one of the most iconic tragic epics in modern media. On the surface, it looks like a sci-fi mecha show, teenagers piloting giant robots to save the world from cataclysm. But peel that back and what you're left with is raw psychological torment. These aren't heroes, they're children, lonely, traumatized, manipulated by adults, trapped in machines that literally fuse with their bodies. Their epic battles are just a canvas upon which we, the viewers, consume their despair. And Evangelion knows this. Hideaki Anno doesn't just tell a tragic story, he indicts the audience for seeking it. Why do we lean in, episode after episode, to watch Shinji break down? Why do we crave Asuka's self-destruction, Masato's collapse, Rei's alienation? Anno's cruelest trick is that he dangles the spectacle of mecha action, the familiar digestible form, and then slowly strips it all away, leaving only the naked, unbearable tragedy of being human. By the end, there are no monsters to fight, no heroic arcs, no digestible comic book frames like Barbara's, just psychological ruin and a mirror held up to the viewer. That's the difference between the pieces. Edith Finch shows us curated tragedy, the Truman Show commodified tragedy. Evangelion weaponizes it, forcing us to confront our own appetite for despair. It's not just tragedy presented as epic, it's tragedy that asks why you wanted the epic in the first place. And here's where we circle back to the theme. Why do we lean toward tragedy? Why do we consume it, reframe it, soften it with digestible packaging at first? Why did I want to know Barbara's real story in the first place? Why did I need to know if Truman could ever find real freedom? Why did I need to see if Shinji ever overcomes his sorrows? Because tragedy is both unbearable and irresistible. It devastates us, yet we need to give it form. Sometimes that form is art, sometimes myth, sometimes a comic book left on a dresser. We pervert tragedy because raw grief is too sharp to hold in our hands. Maybe that's why Pun Pun frightens me. The tragedy within it feels so real from the very beginning. But that's also why I think we're so fascinated by stories like these. We cling to tragedy because deep down, we know it's inevitable. And stories let us rehearse grief in ways life never will. Because petals sink in silent rivers. And sometimes, it's easier to watch them drift away than to admit we've lost the whole flower.